Craig didn't shout. That was the thing about him. He never raised his voice. He sat in his corner office on the 22nd floor of Kessler Financial, leaning back in his leather chair the way he leaned back when he was certain of something, and he said it the way he said everything that didn't require effort. Like it was already decided. Like she wasn't a person at all, but a budget line that had outlasted its usefulness. She was never anything more than the right face at the right time, he said into the phone. Investors liked having her at dinners. That's all she ever was. Ainsley stood in the hallway outside his office, holding a paper bag from her own café. Turkey and brie on sourdough because it was Tuesday, and Craig always had turkey and brie on Tuesday, and felt something in her chest go still in a way that was nothing like calm. She had driven 40 minutes through Chicago traffic for this, had left Paloma to manage the lunch rush alone, had told herself, somewhere around the Eisenhower, that this was a small thing, a kind thing, that marriages needed small, kind things to stay alive. She had been trying to believe that for a while now. She didn't go in. She didn't announce herself. She turned around and walked back the way she had come, past the receptionist's desk, past the elevator bay, and she set the paper bag on the front desk on her way out. For whoever, she said to the woman at reception. The woman looked confused. Ainsley took the elevator down and walked out into November and stood on Wicker Drive for a moment with the wind coming off the river and understood, in the particular way you understand something that your body already knew before your mind caught up, that her marriage was over. If you've ever stood on a sidewalk holding a truth you didn't ask for, knowing your whole life was about to restructure itself around a single sentence, drop a like and stay with me. This story goes somewhere real. She got through November. That was the first thing she learned about herself. She was better at functioning under wreckage than she had known. The cafe on Milwaukee Avenue still opened at 6:30 every morning. The sourdough still proved overnight. Skye still needed to be at school by 8, with her backpack and her lunch, and the specific argument she was always midway through about whatever she'd been reading the night before. The morning after Ainsley heard what she heard, Skye came to breakfast with her library book tucked under her arm and said, without looking up, "Did you know honeybees can recognize human faces? Like actually recognize them individually?" "I didn't know that," Ainsley said. "It's in the brain structure, the way they process patterns." Skye set the book on the table and looked at her mother with the particular look she had, diagnostic, too old for 7, the look of someone already building hypotheses. "You look tired." "I had a long day yesterday." Skye considered this. "Did you save anyone?" Ainsley looked at her daughter, at the gap where her front tooth had finally come out last week, at the ink on her fingers from a marker that had bled through, at the expression that knew when something was being managed around it even if it didn't know the shape of the thing. "Not yesterday," she said. "But I'm working on it." She told Craig the following Sunday. Not in the kitchen, not with raised voices. She sat across from him in the living room of their Lakeview house and told him what she had heard and watched his face do the thing his face did when a situation had moved against him. The careful recalibration, the assessment of angles. "You're being dramatic," he said. "I'm not. Whatever you think you heard." "Craig," she said it quietly. Something in her voice made him stop. "I'm not here to argue about what I heard. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you I want a divorce." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "You'll regret this." "Probably not as much as you think," she said. The divorce took 4 months and cost more than it should have. There were lawyers and custody schedules and 2 sessions with a mediator that left Ainsley feeling scraped to the bone. There was a night in January when Skye cried in the dark and asked why Daddy wasn't coming home for good, and Ainsley sat on the edge of her daughter's bed and held her hand and told her the version of the truth a 7-year-old could carry, that sometimes grown-ups couldn't stay married, that it had nothing to do with how much Daddy loved her, nothing in the world. She cried in the bathroom afterward for a few minutes. Then she washed her face and went back to being the solid thing. By spring, she had the apartment in Wicker Park, smaller than what they were used to, with a radiator that made noise and a view of a parking structure and a kitchen that got too hot in summer. She had Sky 4 days out of 7 on a schedule that felt designed by someone who had never actually lived inside a family. She had the café. She had Paloma, who had worked alongside her since culinary school and who communicated primarily in blunt observations and very good espresso drinks. She had Sky's ongoing scientific commentary on every phenomenon the universe produced. It wasn't the life she had imagined. It turned out to be one she could breathe in. She met him again in October, 8 months after the apartment. She was behind the counter during a slow Thursday afternoon, restocking the pastry case, when she became aware of someone standing at the far end of the counter, not waiting to order, just standing. The kind of stillness that came from a person who had learned a long time ago that they didn't need to announce themselves to be present. She looked up. Brennan Locke was leaner than she remembered, with the kind of quiet that had settled deeper into him, the way rivers settled in autumn. He had a few years on her face and something that had calcified in his jaw since the last time she'd seen him. The last time she'd seen him had been 8 years ago, 2 months before she started dating Craig. When she'd told him she didn't think it was going anywhere, and he'd nodded once and said, okay. Just okay, no argument, no negotiation. She had thought about that okay more than once in the years that followed. You own this place, he said, not a question. 4 years. She wiped her hands on her apron. Brennan. Ainsley. He said her name the way people said things they'd been careful not to say for a long time, neutral but not quite. I have a meeting on Hubbard. Thought I'd get coffee first. What do you take? Black. 2 sugars. She made it. He sat at the corner table by the window, and he didn't leave for an hour and a half. And at some point she brought him a piece of the walnut coffee cake, because it was going to go dry by closing anyway, and he thanked her the way people thanked you when they were actually paying attention. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. Their conversations grew the way slow things grew, without announcement. He asked about the café, not politely but specifically, how she sourced the beans, whether the sourdough starter was her original culture, what she'd done differently the second year when the business model stopped working and she'd had to rebuild it. She found herself answering in full the way she answered people who were actually going to use what she told them. She learned that he ran a shipping and logistics company out of a building on the river, that he'd expanded from his father's original operation into something considerably larger and less straightforward than it appeared on paper. He didn't say that last part. She read it in the things he didn't say, the careful way he described certain partnerships, the presence of a man named Dex, who was always within sight of the window when Brennan was inside. She knew who Brennan Locke was. She had known, in the vague peripheral way that people who lived in Chicago and paid attention knew, since before she'd met him 8 years ago. It hadn't stopped her then. It didn't stop her from refilling his coffee now. He met Sky on a Saturday when Ainsley had her for the weekend and brought her along because the alternative was finding a sitter on 40 minutes' notice. Sky came through the cafe door in her coat, already talking, already mid-thought about something she'd read that morning. She stopped when she saw Brennan at his corner table. "Who's that?" she said, not quietly. "Someone I know." Sky walked directly up to him with the approach of a person who found hesitation inefficient. "Hi, I'm Sky. Do you know about bees?" Brennan looked at her, the same quality of attention he gave everyone, unperformative, simply present. Some. What aspect? Face recognition. They can actually identify individual humans. I'm trying to understand how they store the pattern. She looked at his newspaper. You're reading about the water supply. I am. That's interesting, too. Sit down, he said. Tell me about the bees. Sky sat down without looking at her mother, which Ainsley recognized as a first. She stood behind the counter with a pulled espresso and watched her daughter explain apian neurology to a man who ran, among other things, a criminal organization, and felt something move in her chest that she didn't try to name because she was still learning not to be afraid of things she felt. When they left 40 minutes later, Skye said, without preamble, "He asked me a question I didn't know the answer to. Did he? Whether bees in urban environments develop different recognition patterns than bees in rural ones, because the faces would be denser, more variety." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about it, and I think yes, but I need more data." "I like him," Skye added, the way she said things that were settled. "He doesn't pretend to know things he doesn't know." The call came on a Wednesday evening in late January. Ainsley was closing up the café, wiping down the last of the tables. When Brennan came through the door, she hadn't locked yet. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not a loss of composure, but a compression of it. The look of a man managing something underneath the surface that required all available management. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set down the cloth. "How bad?" "Sit down." She sat. He told her about Tarrant, a man named Owen Tarrant, who had been his chief logistics officer for 7 years and who had been using Brennan's shipping routes that ran through 3 Great Lakes ports, to move people, not goods. People. He'd discovered it 4 months ago and had been building the case to dismantle it from the inside. He had not moved fast enough. "He knows about you," Brennan said. The cafe was quiet around them. Ainsley could hear the refrigerator hum. "How?" "He's been thorough." Brennan set his phone on the table between them. On the screen was a photograph taken through a car windshield at a low angle in front of Skye's school. It showed Skye coming out the front door in her coat, backpack on, already mid-thought. Ainsley looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked up. "Is she safe right now?" "I have 2 men on her school. I put them in place an hour ago." "Their names." He told her. He described them. She wrote it down on the cafe's order notepad. "My mother," she said. "On the north side. I have someone watching her building." He paused. "I need you to keep your routine. Same hours, same patterns. If Tarrant is having you watched, and he may be, any change signals to him that something shifted." Ainsley looked at her hands flat on the table. Steady hands. She had always had steady hands, even when the rest of her wasn't. "Okay," she said. He looked at her, the particular look she'd come to recognize, where he was reading something her face was doing and deciding how to hold it. "Okay? You told me. That was the right thing. Now we figure out what comes next." She met his eyes. "Don't make me regret trusting you." He held her gaze. "I won't." The following days required a particular kind of discipline, performing normalcy while something entirely else moved underneath. She opened the cafe. She made espresso and sourdough and kept her face arranged. Paloma watched her for 3 days before she asked directly. "Something's wrong." "I'm fine." "Ainsley." Paloma leaned against the counter. She deployed a pointed silence. "There's a situation," Ainsley said. "I can't explain it yet, but it's being handled." "By you?" "By someone who knows what he's doing." Paloma was quiet, then Brennan Locke. "Yes." Paloma absorbed this with the stillness she brought to things she'd partly expected. "You know who he is." "I've always known." A pause. "Be careful about the part where you can't stop." "I know," Ainsley said. Her mother called on a Friday morning and didn't answer that evening. Ainsley called back twice, told herself it was nothing, called a 3rd time. Loretta Marsh was 62 years old and lived alone in a Rogers Park apartment and had a habit of falling asleep during the news with her phone on silent, but she answered Ainsley's calls. She always answered. She didn't answer. Ainsley was already calling Brennan when her phone rang, and it was him. "Your mother's not at her apartment," he said. His voice was flat and controlled. Her neighbor went to check. No sign of disturbance. Her phone is there. Ainsley sat down on the edge of the cafe counter and was quiet for 3 seconds. She was aware of the refrigerator humming again. She kept her breathing even by an act of will she didn't entirely understand. "Is she alive?" she said. "I believe so. She has no value to him otherwise." That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have right now. A pause. I'm going to get her back, but I need you to go somewhere safe while I do. Tell me everything first. He told her everything. Tarrant wanted Brennan to step back from the internal investigation, sign over operational authority over the Northern Shipping Network, and exit. Her mother was the pressure point. A meeting was arranged for that evening. You're going to use the negotiation as cover, Ainsley said, to find where she is. Yes. How long? A few hours, maybe more. She looked out the cafe window at the October street. The trees were going bare. A woman walked past with a dog on a yellow leash, completely unaware. The ordinary, enormous life of a city that had no idea what was happening 2 blocks from her. Every hour, Ainsley said. You don't go more than an hour without calling me. Every hour, he said. Brennan. She dropped her voice to something lower, more fundamental. If something has happened to her, if Tarrant has hurt her in any way, I need to hear that from you, not from anyone else, not after, you. You'll hear it from me, he said. I promise. She went to the apartment in Lincoln Park that Dex arranged. Clean, anonymous, no connection to Brennan on paper. She brought Paloma because she couldn't be alone with what her mind was doing. They sat in the kitchen of the safe apartment, and Paloma made tea and they didn't talk much, which was one of the things Ainsley had always loved about her, the understanding that silence wasn't absence. At 9:15 that night, her phone rang. She's with me, Brennan said. Ainsley sat very still for a moment, then, is she hurt? No, shaken. She's ready to be angry about it. Something unspooled in Ainsley's chest that had been wound very tight for 18 hours. That's her. I know. Dex will bring her to you. A pause. Brennan. Yes. Are you hurt? The pause was a half-second too long, minimally. That's not a number. I'll see you in an hour, he said. He arrived at 10:47 with his jacket open, and a split along his left cheekbone that had been taped with something approximate, the look of a man who had done something that cost more than it showed. Loretta was with Dex. She came through the door first, spotted Ainsley, and did the thing Loretta Marsh always did when she was trying not to cry in front of people, which was to make her expression very brisk and practical. There was a woman there who was kind, Loretta said, because this was the first thing she needed to say. I don't know who she was, but she was kind, in case that matters. It matters, Ainsley said, and held her mother for a long time. Later, after Loretta was asleep and Paloma had gone to the couch, Ainsley sat across from Brennan at the kitchen table and looked at his face in the light. The split cheekbone, the way he was holding his left side when he thought she wasn't watching. Show me, she said. It's fine. I didn't ask if it was fine. Show me. He lifted his shirt. 2 ribs, maybe 3. She couldn't tell without imaging. She pressed carefully with her fingertips, systematic, methodical, and he breathed through it in the controlled way of someone with experience managing pain rather than performing it. His skin was warm under her hands. He was very still in a way that said something about trust. The specific trust of a person who had stopped controlling everything for a moment and was letting someone else carry the weight of it. Taped, she said. We tape them tonight and you get imaging tomorrow. Tomorrow. She got the first aid kit from the bathroom. She sat beside him on the kitchen chair and wrapped his ribs with the focused efficiency she brought to problems that had a concrete solution. When she finished, she didn't move away immediately. She stayed close, her hands resting at the edge of the bandage, aware of the warmth of him, aware that she was not afraid of it. She looked up, and he was looking at her. She put both hands against his face. The way she'd wanted to every time she'd watched him sit at the corner table, with his coffee and his careful, unhurried attention. She turned his face slightly to look at the cut on his cheekbone. His jaw shifted under her palms, just barely. The adjustment of a person unaccustomed to being touched without agenda. She pressed her forehead against his. Not a kiss. Something more specific than a kiss. The acknowledgement of weight shared, of 2 people who had both been carrying too much and had finally found someone to put it down with. "Don't keep things from me to protect me," she said quietly. "I know." She pulled back and looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was very quiet, and her mother was asleep in the next room, and somewhere across the city, Skye was safe in her bed. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. Tarrant, the confrontation near the lake, the documentation he'd spent 4 months building. The way it ended, not with force alone, but with leverage. A lawyer, clean, with a sealed package and instructions to deliver its contents to the FBI's Organized Crime Division if Brennan didn't check in by midnight. Tarrant was gone. The network was dismantled. "Is it over?" she said. "The immediate danger is over. The reorganization takes weeks." "But she's safe. Skye is safe." "Yes." She looked at the table, then at him. "I'm angry at you," she said. He stilled. "Not for tonight. For being the door Tarrant walked through to get to my mother." She held his gaze. "I know that's not entirely fair. I know what you've been trying to build and why. But she was in a room she didn't choose for 18 hours, and I need you to hear that from me directly. Because if I don't say it, it becomes a thing that sits between us, and I won't let that happen." He didn't qualify it or explain around it. He simply said, "You're right." She looked at him for a long moment in the kitchen light. He had a cut on his cheekbone and tape on his ribs and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running on controlled precision for days and was only now letting the surface settle. "Stay," she said. "The couch, Dex can take the chair." He stayed. The weeks that followed didn't announce themselves as significant. Brennan worked. The reorganization of the lock operation took the shape of something more controlled, leaner, with lines he'd been drawing for years finally hardened into policy. The people who hadn't crossed those lines stayed. The ones who didn't. He came to the café on Thursdays. He came to Wicker Park on weekday evenings when Skye was at Craig's, and they made dinner or didn't, and they talked the way people talked who had been honest with each other from the beginning and were discovering what that felt like as a foundation rather than an exception. On a Thursday in March, Paloma caught Ainsley smiling at nothing in particular between the morning and lunch rush, the way you smiled when you were thinking about something you hadn't meant to think about and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of commentary. Skye came back from Craig's on a Sunday and said, without looking up from the back seat of the car, "Is Brennan your boyfriend?" Ainsley met her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror. "We're figuring that out." What does that mean? It means we like each other and we're taking it carefully. Skye thought about this. Because of his work? Partly. Is it because of me? No. Firmly enough that Skye looked up. Not because of you, never because of you. You are not a reason to be careful in a way that means less. Do you understand that? Skye studied her mother's face. "Yes," she said. "Then he still owes me an answer about the urban bees." "You could ask him." "I know," Skye said, and returned to her window. Spring came to Chicago the way it always came, suddenly, without apology, as though it had been there all along, and winter was the visitor. The first real warm day in early April, Ainsley stood outside the cafe before opening and let it land on her face for a moment. She was not a person who stopped for things. She had spent years in motion because motion felt like control. But she stood on Milwaukee Avenue and let the warmth be what it was. Then she went inside and opened up. Brennan came in that evening, not for coffee. Skye was home, and he'd brought a printed journal article about apian learning behavior that Dex had found online, because Skye had sent Dex 3 follow-up questions about the urban bee hypothesis, and he'd gone looking. Ainsley stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Brennan and Skye at the table. Skye with the article, pointing out a methodology problem, Brennan leaning forward to look where she was pointing, asking a question that made her stop and actually think before answering. She brought 2 mugs of tea and sat down across from them both. Later, after Skye was in bed, she and Brennan sat on the apartment's small back porch in the April dark, and she said the thing she'd been working toward for months. I'm not going to stop running the cafe because this gets complicated, she said. I know. And I'm not going to pretend to Sky that your world is something other than what it is. When she's old enough to understand the real version, she gets the real version. I wouldn't want it any other way. She looked at him. Craig told me once that I was too direct, that I made things harder than they needed to be. She paused. I used to believe that. For a while, I actually believed the problem was me, that I asked too much, expected too much honesty from someone who'd never intended to give it. She looked at the dark above the rooftops. It took a long time to understand that wasn't directness being a flaw. It was just incompatibility dressed up as my fault. You're not too direct, Brennan said. I know. She looked at him. That's what I'm telling you. I know that now. He reached over and held her face in both hands the way she had held his face in the Lincoln Park kitchen. Not gently, but with the steadiness of a person making something real, verifying something that words could only approximate. She leaned into it, just slightly. The first uncalculated thing she'd allowed herself in longer than she could measure. I'm not going to be easy, he said. Neither am I. My world doesn't get clean. I'm not asking for clean, she said. I'm asking for honest. I've had clean and it was a lie. I'll take the honest version of complicated over that every time. He held her gaze in the April dark. Somewhere below them, a car moved down the alley. The city continued its enormous, indifferent existence around them, full of 10 million lives that each felt, from the inside, like the only life that mattered. She kissed him. Finally, after all the Thursdays and the coffee and the bee conversations and the Lincoln Park kitchen, she just kissed him, because the thing that had been building needed somewhere real to go. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he gave everything, full, unhurried, like she was worth slowing down for. In May, Sky's class held a science fair. Sky built a display board about apian facial recognition with a section at the end proposing her urban versus rural recognition hypothesis, the one she'd been developing for 3 months, the one that had started with a question Brennan asked at a corner table in October. He came. He sat in the school gymnasium with Loretta on his left and Ainsley on his right, no bodyguards visible, just a man who had told his people he needed 2 hours in an elementary school auditorium and didn't want it to look like a security operation. When it was over, Sky found them in the crowd and stood in front of Brennan with her ribbon, 3rd place, and said, "The judges didn't understand the urban hypothesis." "No," he said, "they probably didn't." "That's okay. I'm going to publish it eventually." He looked at her with the full attention he always gave her. "Send me the draft when it's ready." Sky considered this. Okay. Then she looked at Ainsley, then back at Brennan. "Are you staying for dinner?" Brennan looked at Ainsley. "Yes," she said. "He's staying for dinner." Sky nodded once, the way she settled things, efficiently, without ceremony, and turned toward where Loretta was waiting with cookies from the refreshment table. Brennan stood in the gymnasium in his coat, the noise of other families moving around them, the late May light coming through the high windows, and the expression of a man who was somewhere he hadn't expected to be allowed to be. "She's going to be formidable," he said. "She already is," Ainsley said. They followed her toward the door. Months later, when people asked Ainsley about the year, her mother asked, Paloma asked, the therapist she'd started seeing in February asked, she found she didn't explain it in terms of what had happened. Not the parking garage on Wicker, not the divorce, not the moment she'd heard her husband say she was nothing more than a face at the right dinner, not Tarrant, not the Lincoln Park kitchen, not any of it. She explained it in terms of what she'd understood. That you could build a life at 34 that looked nothing like the life you'd planned and turn out to be the better for it. That the opposite of a marriage built on strategy wasn't a marriage built on passion. It was one built on honesty. Those were different things, and it had taken her a long time to understand the difference. That her daughter was going to grow up in a house where the adults told each other the truth, even when it was hard, especially then. That was the only inheritance she'd ever cared about giving her. That safety wasn't the absence of complicated things. It was knowing that when complicated things arrived, you wouldn't be alone in them, and you wouldn't be lied to about their shape. She told the therapist in April that she'd stopped waiting for evidence that she was allowed to be all right. What changed? The therapist asked. Ainsley thought about it for a moment, about the café in the morning, about Skye at the kitchen table, about Brennan's hands steady on her face in the April dark of the back porch. I stopped making the choice provisionally, she said. I just made it. The therapist wrote something down. Ainsley looked out the office window at the Chicago spring, the trees on the street finally full, the light coming in at the particular angle of a season that was beginning rather than ending. She made her next appointment and put on her coat and went back to work. On a morning in June, Brennan came downstairs in the Wicker Park apartment. He had a key now, had had one since April, a fact established without announcement because Ainsley did nothing with announcement and found the kitchen already moving. Ainsley was at the counter with her coffee. Skye was at the table with a library book and a notebook full of calculations, eating toast in the distracted way of someone for whom eating was secondary to thinking. The morning light came through the kitchen window at the angle that June made. Warm, direct, the light of a season that had decided to stay. Brennan made coffee. He put a mug beside Ainsley without saying anything. She picked it up without looking away from what she was doing, which was reading the cafe's weekly order sheet and making notes in the margin. The sample size in this study is wrong, Skye said from the table, not looking up. Which study? Brennan said. Plant communication through fungal networks. The old growth section only has 4 sites. You can't generalize from 4 sites. No, he agreed, you can't. Skye looked up at him over the edge of the notebook. Do you actually know about plant communication, or are you agreeing to agree? I'm agreeing because you're right, he said. I don't know about plant communication, but I know about sample sizes. Skye appeared to find this acceptable. She returned to her notebook. Ainsley turned from the counter and looked at her kitchen, at Brennan with his coffee, at Skye arguing with someone else's methodology, at the June light on the floor, and held it for a moment the way she'd held the April air on the sidewalk outside the café, without hurrying through it. Then she sat down at the table and drank her coffee. There were no declarations, no moment that needed to announce itself as significant. Just the morning, arriving and requiring the small ordinary things that made a life, and 3 people in a kitchen in Wicker Park, each knowing exactly where they were. For the first time in longer than she could name, that was enough. That was, in the end, everything.